Fellas, let's debunk the entire UFC career of Jon Jones, starting off with the fight with Stipe Miocic. Stipe wasn't even the #1 contender. It was supposed to be Tom Aspinall, who was in his prime, interim champion, had defended the interim belt, and everybody wanted to see him. Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall was the fight to make in November of 2024 instead of Stipe Miocic. Tom Aspinall had the interim belt. Everybody wanted to see that fight, rather than Stipe, who was 42 years old, had been knocked out by Francis Ngannou brutally in his last fight and had been inactive for 3 years. Nobody wanted to see this fight. Even when the announcement was made, nobody wanted to see this fight. It was a disgrace that was actually a title fight in the UFC, and Stipe actually gave it a good go despite coming in out of shape, 42 years old, whatever, and it still took Jon Jones 3 rounds to finish Stipe Miocic. So that Stipe Miocic versus Jones debunked should have never happened. Jon Jones versus Cyril Gane. Now, Jon Jones came back against Cyril Gane after 3 years of bulking up, when in reality he was just ducking Francis Ngannou, and you've got one of the best grapplers in Jon Jones against Cyril Gane, who had already been smothered and exposed for having bad grappling by Francis Ngannou, and his best wins were Derek Lewis and Tatu Ivaza. He gets the title fight with Jon Jones, and as expected, Jon Jones takes him down and gets a submission over Cyril Gane pretty comfortably, and I don't think anyone was really surprised by that happening. So Jon Jones versus Cyril Gane, debunked. Stylistically an easy fight for Jon Jones. Jon Jones versus Dominic Reyes. Now, when Dominic Reyes took on Jon Jones, this is, most people would agree, one of the few times in the UFC where Jon Jones actually lost. He got absolutely pieced up by Dominic Reyes through rounds 1 to round 3. Round 4 was controversial. Round 5, Jon Jones won. But the fact that Jon Jones actually had his hand raised by the end of the fight was one of the biggest robberies in UFC history. Nobody, including Jon Jones fans, think that Jon Jones won this fight. Dominic Reyes was robbed. It's actually one of the biggest robberies in UFC history on multiple different rankings online. Dominic Reyes won the fight. Jon Jones shouldn't have won. That should have counted as a loss, and we never got to see the rematch because, again, Jon Jones ducked him. So that's Jon Jones versus Dominic Reyes, debunked. Jon Jones versus Thiago Santos. Now, Thiago Santos came into this fight with multiple different injuries on his leg, so he wasn't really in fit shape for a title fight, and despite that, again, still put up a really good title fight against Jon Jones, put up a really good go against him. Ended up falling short via decision, but an injured Thiago Santos still actually won a couple of rounds against Jon Jones on the judges' scorecard. One judge actually gave it to Thiago Santos, and Jones won a split decision win over Thiago Santos, who ended up losing the majority of his fights after the fight with Jones and came in injured. So Jon Jones versus Thiago Santos, debunked. Jon Jones versus Anthony Smith, the greatest of all time, went 5 rounds with Anthony Smith. You're going to a decision with Anthony Smith, and you want to claim yourself as the greatest of all time. Smile if you finished Anthony Smith. Half the light heavyweight division smile, but Jon Jones can't. You couldn't even get Anthony Smith out of there. Anthony Smith, 38-22. That's not my god. Jon Jones versus Anthony Smith, debunked. Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson, number 2. Now, the first time these guys fought, Jon Jones arguably lost the first fight, which we'll get onto. And since their first fight, Alexander Gustafsson had been knocked out by Anthony Rumble Johnson and beaten by DC over Teixeira and Blachowicz. And Jon Jones gets the finish over Alexander Gustafsson, but the fact that Gustafsson didn't only lose to Jon Jones at that moment in time, but they were on a massive losing streak, suggested it was out of prime Alexander Gustafsson compared to the first fight. Jones versus Gustafsson, number 2, debunked. Jones versus DC, number 2. Now, this was a massive rivalry. This was a fight that was very hyped. Both of these guys taking each other on. What could go wrong? How could Jon Jones find a way to fuck this up? Well, Jon Jones ends up knocking him out. He TKOs DC in the 3rd round, gets the finish over DC. Undebunkable, right? How can I possibly bring something out to debunk it? Well, I can, because Jon Jones tested positive for steroids again for the 2nd time in his career in this fight. Jon Jones was a filthy drug cheat who took steroids in this fight with DC, so he got overturned to a no contest, and he didn't actually win the fight. Jones versus DC, number 2, debunked. Jones versus OSP.
My god, bro. Oh, hell no, man.
All I'm going to say is OSP went 5 rounds with Jon Jones. The fact that Jon Jones, who was closer to his prime, couldn't even finish OSP at this moment in time was disgraceful. Bearing in mind that OSP was on a 1-fight win streak coming into this, and he had already been finished by Glover Teixeira. And after the fight with Jon Jones, he then went on a 2-fight losing streak and got knocked out by Jimmy Manuwa in his very next fight. That's the greatest of all time? I don't think so. Jones versus OSP, debunked. Jones versus DC, number 1. Now, the first time these guys fought each other, it was a very back and forth fight. DC did well with the wrestling. Jon Jones was controlling most of the fight, and he was obviously winning most of the rounds, and he ended up getting a decision win. But the fact that DC traumatized Jon Jones so bad he had to juice up the 2nd time, I'm sorry, Jones, I'm going to have to debunk that one as well. Jones versus Glover Teixeira. Jon Jones dominated this fight, but he had to do it via cheating. The amount of eye pokes, groin shots, and dirty tactics Jon Jones used to win this fight, he was a dirty cheat throughout this entire performance. And Glover ended up losing his next fight anyway to Phil Davis. Jon Jones versus Glover Teixeira, debunked. Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson, number 1. Now, the first time these guys took each other on, Alexander Gustafsson actually worked Jon Jones, was the first guy to take him down, was piecing up Jon Jones on the feet, putting him in an absolute dogfight. Look at Jon Jones' face after the fight, how bloodied up and bruised and battered he was compared to Alexander Gustafsson. And again, Jon Jones wins a decision that was very controversial. Most fans at the time, and still do, think that Alexander Gustafsson won that fight, and the fact that Jones barely scraped past Gustafsson and probably shouldn't have been given the decision at that moment in time. Jones versus Gustafsson, number 1, debunked. Jon Jones versus Chael Sonnen. Now, when Jon Jones took on Chael Sonnen approaches Jon, pulls guard, rips the toe off Jon Jones, and he recently exclaimed that in his Twitter, won the fight. Jon Jones felt the wrath of Chael Sonnen. So Jon Jones versus Chael Sonnen, debunked. Jon Jones versus Vitor Belfort. This is when Trinidad meets TRT. Should have automatically been a no contest. This couldn't have been a qualified MMA fight under the rules of steroids. Now, Jon Jones got his arm dislocated practically within 2 minutes, ends up submitting Vitor in round 4. They're 1-1 in submissions. Jones versus Vitor Belfort, debunked. Jones versus Rashad Evans. Yeah, Jon Jones took on Rashad Evans, a former teammate of him, and he was working Rashad Evans most of the fight. He won this fight pretty comfortably. It was a dominant performance, but bearing in mind that Rashad Evans was past his prime, and he went on to lose 6 of his next 8 fights, shows that he wasn't in the best state. So Jones beating Rashad Evans, fair enough, but it's kind of debunked. Jon Jones versus Lyoto Machida. Lyoto Machida is a middleweight. This guy should have never fought in the light heavyweight division. He was massively undersized. And coming into the Jon Jones fight, Lyoto Machida had been finished Shogun, beat Rampage Jackson, and had a win over Randy Couture. He managed to get a title fight from that, showing that he's not in the best state. And he actually beat Jon Jones in that first round. He was piecing Jon Jones up in that first round, making it look pretty good. Jon Jones gets the submission over Lyoto Machida, chokes him out cold, and congrats on submitting the inconsistent middleweight karate practitioner Jon Jones. Jones versus Lyoto Machida, debunked. Jones versus Rampage Jackson. Yeah, Rampage Jackson bullied Jon Jones beforehand. The press conference wasn't even close. 10-8 from Rampage Jackson in the press conference.
So with Rampage Jackson, I kept having these nightmares that I would get knocked out. And I prayed this prayer asking God to just give me the supernatural, like reaction abilities, speed, flexibility, awareness.
And then Jon Jones submits Rampage Jackson, and the fact that he beat a past his prime Rampage when his prime was 2009, and he used black magic to beat him as well, which in my opinion is kind of cheating to beat Rampage. Jones versus Rampage Jackson, debunked. Jon Jones versus Shogun Rua. Prime Shogun was back in Pride 2002 to 2007 when he was just starching people left, right, and center. Pride FC Shogun was at his best. The Jones fight Shogun in 2011 was not Prime Shogun. He was 3-2 before fighting Jon Jones, and was 3-5 after fighting Jon Jones. This weren't Prime Shogun. Now, to be fair to Jon Jones, he did pick him apart the entire fight and get the finish off. Gotta give him credit for that, but wasn't a Prime Shogun. It was just the beginning of the end, debunked. And then the other career of Jon Jones in the UFC, Ryan Bader, Bellator, Tick, Matishenko, Vera, Jake O'Brien, and Guzman, they're all cans. Matt Hamill beat Jon Jones, so you lost that fight, as well as Alexander Gustafsson and Dominic Reyes, and Stephan Bonner, who was injured coming into that fight. Now, reacting to some of the tweets that Jon Jones has been dropping recently regarding this whole situation, he's been on another Twitter rant over this past weekend, which I thought we'd react to. Starting off with the first tweet that I think is relevant. Unfortunately, my boy is not as special as his fan base thinks. I've seen Tom get tapped out twice by 2 different people. Time will show. Here today, gone tomorrow. Well, if you look at Tom Aspinall's record, one of them was an injury to Curtis Blades a few years ago. One of them was a fluke disqualification in the fact that he was dominating, and that shouldn't have actually been disqualified. It wasn't even against the rule set of BAMA, which was the promotion that Aspinall was on. And he has been submitted, but it was over a decade ago against Stu Austin, who's actually kind of on a bit of a run in PFL. And to say that he's here today, gone tomorrow, mate, look at his record. He's been here for 5 years. He's been an interim champion since 2023. Wrong example. And then he starts talking about how Cyril Gane, everyone was saying the same thing about Cyril Gane as they're saying about Tom Aspinall. You can't compare Cyril Gane to Tom Aspinall. Cyril Gane, at the time of fighting you, he'd already been beaten by Francis Ngannou. He got a title shot from beating Tai fucking Tuivasa. He's known to be very one-dimensional. And like I said before, we'd seen him get beaten comfortably with the grappling by Francis Ngannou. He was exposed by Cyril Gane. And then he's also been dropped by Tai Tuivasa. And then you compare him to Tom Aspinall, who's practically unbeaten in 10 years, beat 5 of the current top 10 ranked heavyweights, and well-rounded, defended the interim champ. And when he said, how would you defeat Tom, he responds by not even giving him the chance. Well, why are you the heavyweight champion? Why do you have a belt? If Tom Aspinall's the only option, there's literally no other option for Jon Jones in the UFC. Alex Pereira's gone. There's nobody else at heavyweight. If Tom's the only option, why are you the champion of the UFC? He also tweets, Jon Jones worked both for y'all. This is alluding to DC and Chael Sonnen talking, not even talking shit, but just kind of critiquing Jon Jones and his behavior on their podcast. Well, I mean, DC, you're beaten by decision in the second time you had to take steroids because you felt the wrath of DC, and Chael Sonnen ripped your toe off. You can't really compare them. And then this Francis Ngannou situation, there's been rumors of Ngannou coming back to the UFC. Jon Jones said he'd be happy to fight Ngannou in the UFC, which is bullshit, because when Francis Ngannou was a champion, Jones was having a mental breakdown on Twitter. Even Dana White himself, the biggest Jon Jones glazer about, said that Jon Jones wasn't accepting the fight with Ngannou. When conveniently, the second that Francis Ngannou leaves the UFC, 2 months later, he comes back and faces Cyril Gane. And then Francis Ngannou responds saying, "You take care of the UFC, I'll take care of PFL, and we'll finally find out who's the king of heavyweight," which is essentially alluding to Aspinall. Even Ngannou, the other big heavyweight threat, he's even advising you to go and take on Tom Aspinall. But Jon Jones is a massive fraud. His entire his entire UFC career debunked, and the fact that he's ducking Tom Aspinall, just a bit more to talk about when it comes to his tweets. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.